Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming so promptly. The event will start at about 6 p.m. So in the meantime, just make yourself comfortable and have a good time. Thank
Test, test.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Test, test. Hi, everyone. We're about to start in 2 minutes, so if you could grab your seats, we're about to begin in a bit. Thank you. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. A very warm welcome to SG Innovate. So I'm Nikki, community builder at SG Innovate, and right now you're actually in Bash. So Bash is another space that we actually have. So we have another space over in Clarke Quay at 32 Carpenter Street where we do events almost on a daily basis also. So it's great to see such a great crowd here today and so many regular faces as well. There's no better way, honestly, to start our month of October events. So at SG Innovate, we solely focus on deep tech, and we strive to be Singapore's deep tech innovation hub. And we don't just focus on AI, blockchain, or medtech, but rather or not, we focus on how deep tech can actually impact and cut across various industries and hopefully solve world problems. So without further ado, I'll pass the time over to Will, who will be the moderator for today's panel, and they'll do the introductions for the rest of our amazing panel today. So please put your hands together for our amazing panel.
Good evening, everybody. So great to be here tonight. My name is Will Greene, and I will be the moderator this evening. I'm going to start by introducing our fantastic panelists over here. We have right here to my left, your right, Francois Cadiou, CEO of Healint. We have Hsien-Hsien, who is head of medical affairs at Medtronic. Joseph Makanu, who is a newly minted VC of Verge Health Tech Fund. And Jeff Weisel, who is a director in the life sciences practice at Ernst & Young. Now, I've known all of the panelists for a couple years now. They're great people. One thing that I will say is that they all have a very diverse range of experience. They've all held multiple types of roles within different types of healthcare companies. So they've all touched upon startups in some way in their careers. Some of them are now very deeply involved in startups, either in the case of Francois, who is running one, or Joseph, who is investing in them. And then, of course, Hsien and Jeff, in corporate roles, work with startups too in various capacities. So those are our panelists, very excited. The way I'd like to start this panel is by speaking with our one representative startup founder and CEO right over here. So the topic today is startups in health tech, how to make them work globally. And Healint is one of a small and, let's say, elite group of startups who have figured out how to make it work globally. So I'd like to start with Francois talking a little bit about his experience starting a company, what, of course, Healint does, and his experience growing it around the region. And then we'll take it from there.
Okay, so we jump into the subjects. So it has been a long trip to be able to work with big corporates all over the world, and now we made Healint become a platform with 1.3 million patients, which became the biggest patient hub, digital patient hub, focused mostly today on CNS, immunology, and other conditions like oncology. We are working with clients such as Novartis and Teva. We have global partnerships. One thing is from Singapore, you have to travel a lot. The past 2 weeks I was in Europe. Next week I'm in New York and in New Jersey. So that's one thing you have to accept when you work with a massive organization, massive global organizations. You have to go and meet people where they are.
Great. And so let's now just move down the line with the panelists. I'd love to know a little bit more about our panelists, their current roles, what they do in their current roles, and how they tend to work with startups in that role.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hsien-Hsien. I am with Medtronic. It's so nice to see some familiar faces and some brave ones sitting in the front row. I'm currently head of medical, clinical, and scientific affairs for Medtronic Asia Pacific. And with that, I also have oversight over external and internal training and education and our value-based healthcare strategy. Now, where's the innovation in that? And where does the startup piece fall into my responsibilities? Part of what I do is also Medtronic Innovation Centers. And we have currently 2 within Asia Pacific, 1 in Korea and 1 in Japan. And the reality is they're completely focused on training and education. So when I took on this role this year, one of my missions is to expand the innovation centers to include things like startup incubation, SME partnerships, thinking about ways in which we can look at clinical research excellence, health economics, and outcomes research, broadening our umbrella under innovation in the region. Because the reality is, as someone asked me just now when I was preparing for this, isn't most of R&D and innovation being top-down, directed from corporate? And yes, to some degree, we set a global strategy. But at the end of the day, we have specific needs within our region that it's responsibility of leaders like me in the region to think about, what does India need? What does Australia need that's different than what global might be thinking about as a global strategy? So that's my responsibility, is to represent the needs of APAC, both from a corporate point of view and both from a patient outcomes point of view.
Thank you. Joseph McAndrew here. I am a newly minted MECE, as Will likes to say. But before that, I was an angel investor in healthcare startups, largely brought about through my consulting career here in Asia. One of the things that we saw consistently were large multinationals trying to do something different, but they lacked the partners, or they lacked kind of the boots on the ground and how to actually execute something a little bit different. And when they did find it, it was usually subscale, usually in one country or so they couldn't really effectively partner with them. So when I was being paid by my clients, most of them were actually multinational pharma companies, some conglomerates, some PE and VC funds, to really see, okay, who's out there, who's investable, who can we work with? I didn't find too many who were at that stage, but there were younger companies that were solving real problems, and they didn't really have investors that would really understand them. So then I thought, well, you know, I used to pay a lot of tax in Canada before I moved here, so I didn't have so much of tax burden here. I'm wearing old clothes, you know, we don't live a very extravagant life. So then we started to invest in these companies ourselves, my wife and I. And so we started to do this 12 companies later. it got a little bit addictive, and then we started looking at the numbers, both in lives touched as well as unrealized IRR, and thought, wow, I'm having way more impact with this hobby of mine than I am in my day job. And we were doing pretty well in the day job as well. But thought, the only reason I wake up in the morning is to finance my hobby, and that is not efficient. So decided to start the fund 4 months ago, actually 5 months ago now that we're in October. And we're about to do our first few deals in the next 3 or 4 weeks. Of course, the long journey is there, and I can empathize with the startups who ask me for money because I'm asking other people for money right now as well, just 10 times as much. So it's been an enjoyable, educational journey, and I vow to the startups who we will work with, and we're not just going to drop money, we're going to actually help them. You can take the consultant out of the consulting firm, but you can never take the consultant out of the person. So we're going to be fairly active and hands-on with our companies. But I vow that I'm not going to forget their journey. And we have pledged to be very founder-friendly, very fair, but not usurious like a lot of investors we see in some of these markets. In that, it's hard enough to be an entrepreneur. A lot of you in healthcare are not, young 20-year-olds who come out fresh of school ready to spend someone else's money to the end of it and try it again. A lot of people have actually given up their careers, sometimes very good careers, have a wife or husband or, have a family. So you've got a lot more to lose than we as investors do. So we want to just keep that in mind as we go forward with, working together potentially. So yeah, the other thing I do want to say in terms of scaling globally, we also source globally. Because while Asia Pacific is the most attractive market from an emerging markets development point of view, that doesn't mean the best ideas exist here. So we're looking for, we're looking at companies as far away as Canada, Belarus, Finland, UK, South Africa, even some here in the Philippines as well. So yeah, that's me and our journey in a nutshell. Jeff?
Thank you. My name is Jeff Weisel. I work for Ernst & Young, or EY. For those of you who are not quite sure what that is, it's one of the big 4 professional services firms. I just want to clarify that I'm not an auditor. I can't give you advice on your taxes. So the part I work in is something called transaction advisory. And what that covers a lot of things, but it includes working with both corporate clients in the healthcare life science space, meaning big companies like Medtronic and Pfizer and companies like that. As well as investors, in our case, some with venture capital, but more often with private equity, with sovereign wealth funds like Temasek, as you may know of. We do not actually work a lot with the startup community, and what we keep close to it for a couple of reasons. One is just generally to know how what's coming up out of the health tech, the startup community, is disrupting the healthcare space. And there is probably no sector in the world more ripe for disruption than healthcare. That's why we're all here, right? So probably just to understand the landscape, what's changing, how are startups particularly addressing some of the pain points in the healthcare sector. And then with our corporate clients, we will often look at where some of these interesting new companies present opportunities for partnership or even co-investment to address some of their needs or some of the emerging needs. So for instance, we have been working with one large pharmaceutical company trying to understand how they can engage with fintech companies. So this is not a fintech discussion, it's a health tech session, but with fintech companies to look at new ways to help people pay for medicines. So looking at, is there a different way to approach a problem that particularly in emerging markets that to date has left people without access to medicine. We also work with the institutional investors like private equity firms to help them understand where are some of the new players where they may be interesting add-ons to the portfolio companies they have. So for instance, a company with an interesting technology platform might fit very well with let's say a distribution company in distributing medical devices, for instance. But we also challenge our investor clients to understand where some of the new companies could in fact be disrupting the companies they themselves have invested in. So again, to understand what's out there and to be able to help guide the investment community to understand what's going on out there. And before I came to EY, though, I was actually also actively involved with advising and investing in a number of health tech startups in the region, some of which you may know have in Singapore and the region. So I do still have that kind of keen interest. I'm still actually mentoring some companies as well, in between my work for corporate clients at EY. So I think that's really where EY plays, really to understand how to help bridge, if you will, some of the gap between the corporate world, our clients, and the startup community.
Great, thank you all for the introductions. And so we're starting to get a little bit into the main topic of the panel now, which is the challenges and opportunities around regional and global expansion for health tech startups. I have some additional questions, but before I do that, I'd love to just do a quick audience poll. Just a show of hands, how many people here work for a health tech startup? Wow, okay, so about 40%. How many people here would like to work for a health tech startup? Okay, fantastic. So we've got.
You guys can clearly talk to each other now, right?
Yeah. How many people here are looking for investment for their health tech startup? Okay.
Oh, this is gonna be fun.
Okay, great. So great to know that we have a lot of health tech startups here in the audience today. So now coming back to the question of challenges and opportunities for expansion, Francois, you said that you have to travel a lot for your work. Maybe tell us where you're going a lot these days. What are some of the markets that you find very exciting, or where you see opportunities where things are happening for you? And maybe also, what are some of the markets where you've tried things but where you've faced obstacles in expansion?
It really depends on the product you have. And in our case, we've designed a product from which when we tested it, we discovered it was really best fitted for the traditional markets. Europe, places where healthcare is reimbursed. So Europe, US, Japan. And so the first project we did was for a big pharma in Japan. And we've been traveling a lot there. And then after that was for the second client was a big pharma in California. Yep, and you can enjoy the 16-hour flights and doing teleconferences at 11 p.m. And then after it has been for another one and more in Europe. And then it comes like that. And you start, depending on your product also, and depending on the maturity of the products you're targeting. In our case, we were in a field where you were having lots of new compounds, new drug being developed. Therefore, we started working with the headquarters, with HEO or with clinical, and then the global. But if you're arriving at different moments, if you're serving hospitals, that will be different, and it could be far more local, for example. So it really depends on the problem you're tackling and the phase you are in the portfolio of your clients.
And Joseph, you said that you're not just helping local companies expand globally, but you're also sourcing ideas globally. What are some of the exciting markets that you see where interesting ideas are arising, places where people in the audience can potentially look to for partnerships or idea sourcing?
Sure. Two of my favorite recent regions are the ex-Soviet Union, as well as the South Africa. I think these are two very interesting and undervalued and underloved places. And one of the unfair advantages, I guess, that we have is that, well, we're willing to provide the capital to them to basically move out. As much as we'd like to keep the local ecosystem, and most of the teams are going to be there, but the domicile needs to move, and we need to also get some people on larger population bases. Because, my joke I always tell my peers are that we love markets where you have scrappy entrepreneurs and crappy investors. And usually, sorry, I hope this isn't on record, but it's on record. Of course it is. Sounds so good. No, but to be honest, these markets have serious needs in healthcare, but also serious challenges in societal fabric, which leads to a higher rate of entrepreneurship. And if we can help kind of, if you look at kind of a catalytic reaction with enzymes, if you can get them over that activation energy, then they can really do wonders. So one company we really love is in Belarus, which is looking at early stage diagnosis of lung diseases, and they've been able to do it with 95% accuracy, where doctors are around between, I don't know, 43 to 70%, depending on the physician. They publicly claim around 60, so they don't make the doctors look too bad. So then the idea is if you can detect a bunch of lung conditions quite early using a cheap digital stethoscope, a lot of pain can be avoided and a lot of care can be shifted to GP, to the pharmacist, or at home. One of my most successful angel investments actually comes from South Africa. And South Africa, you know, if you look at South Africa, it's got one of the most innovative insurers on the planet, Discovery. You know, they are the source of Vitality, which is being licensed in various watered-down forms around the world. On top of that, you've also got some very famous entrepreneurs from South Africa, like Elon Musk, Patrick Soon-Shiong, who's the richest medical doctor on the planet, last I checked, although some of the NANT things have not gone as well as perhaps they might have originally has been expected. So in any case, I think there is a culture of entrepreneurship there as well that offers a lot of opportunities. Again, other places that are really interesting, I think a lot of people know India is famous for reverse innovation. We're looking at one company there in Pune that's really doing something cool. I won't go into more details because we still want to make sure that we get that deal. But you know, you can find innovation everywhere. It's really I think it's at the fringes, to be honest. A lot of attention has been focused on like the Cambridge, the MITs, and yes, there's some cutting edge research there. Yes, we have a venture partner at Hopkins. On the other side, you know, it's the streets of Bangalore or Cebu or, you know, Kinshasa, wherever. You're going to find necessity is creating a lot of innovative things. Some of it may be applicable outside of the home market. So it's a very long-winded answer, but hopefully it addressed it.
That's fine. Thank you, Joseph. So, Hsien, you representing the big corporate medtech perspective, as somebody who has worked with startups who have sought to partner with Medtronic, what have been some of the evaluation criteria that you've applied for determining if a startup is a good partner versus maybe not so much?
Yeah, that's a really important question because I think in the last few months, probably on average, I get pitched something a couple of times a week, which is a lot for a regional office, right? Because most of these, you know, explorations tend to go through the businesses or through the corporate head office. And the reality is most of the pitches are not very good. And I'll tell you why. It's because the person who is pitching never thought to look up what Medtronic's strategy is. And we're very open about our global strategy. If you look on our website, you'll see it in various forms. And it starts with universal healthcare needs. We're very focused on ensuring that what we do improves patient outcomes, improves global access, as well as has both a clinical and economic value to contribute. It's very simple. And we believe those are basic universal healthcare needs. Now, how does our corporate strategy ladder up to that? Well, it's therapy optimization, so taking existing technology that we currently sell or are in the pipeline and making them better, right? Addressing very specific needs in the care pathway. And then secondly, from access point of view, if your technology is scalable and has reach across multiple patient populations, the bigger the better, right? Because that helps us expand healthcare access. And then finally, of course, you have to prove that your technology has clinical and economic value, but that's harder and harder to demonstrate nowadays because of the additional requirements put upon us by regulatory and by reimbursement. And as some of you may know, Medtronic has been one of the most outspoken advocates of value-based healthcare. And it's a concept that you need to be able to demonstrate improved patient outcomes through a technology, a service, or a solution, but at the same time, be able to provide that at lower cost because we're all going bankrupt from paying for healthcare, right? We've got to become more effective and more efficient. So if we then say that our strategy is surrounded by the concepts of value-based healthcare, and you come and you pitch an idea to us, and all you focus on is the clinical, interesting innovation aspect of your idea, that's not going to be good enough, right? Because as a company, you guys okay? Okay. We should relax a little bit, right? And also, by the way, there's one more seat in the front if anybody wants a seat. But, you know, so, sorry, what were you going to say?
You shattered someone's company there.
I know, I'm sorry. But just come better prepared. I mean, that's basically it, right? Because when you come and you just tell us that you've got some clinical data, clinical evidence, some pathophysiology that makes this big idea all make sense, as a scientist, I completely buy into that. But as a company, it's not enough. It needs to prove that it's financially scalable, it's financially sound, that it's scalable, and it's going to provide some level of economic return to the company from a, you know, maybe in a quarter or within a year. You know, the timelines are so short and tight nowadays for big companies because of shareholder pressure that we just don't have the timeline to say, come on in and we'll see how it goes. So I hope that answers what I'm looking for when you first have that conversation with me.
Yeah, and maybe just another follow, or you want to?
Maybe on that point, yes. We even from the other side, we really see that if you want to have a long-term relation with a big corporate, you need to have the capacity to show the value of what you're doing, and in the end, everything arrives at patient outcome. If what you do is fancy, you have artificial intelligence, blockchain, and everything in it, 20 patents, but it's not improving the patient outcome in the end, that makes no sense. That needs to be the end point, and whatever the innovation is in it.
So I see Joseph raising his hand over here and wants to.
It's okay if you want to.
Well, I'd like to get Jeff in here. So I guess, you know, and reacting to Hsien, who comes from from Medtronic, which is a big medical technology company. But of course, when we think about health tech, this is a pretty broad term that can encompass a lot of different industry segments. Depending on how you define it, it could include digital health, it could include medical technology as in like equipment, it could include biotech, it could include digitally mediated healthcare services. So when we look across the full spectrum of health tech, Jeff, as somebody who works with corporates to help them identify areas for potential disruption, within these various segments of industry, what do you see as being some of the more exciting, disruptive segments, and maybe what are some of the quieter ones?
Okay. First of all, maybe I would take biotech out of the equation. I think that's a very different kind of space, just because simply the lead times to develop technologies are years and years, not maybe months, and you know, and so I think the economics are different, and you know, so. But I think if we look at more the health tech space, to be honest, the area I think is most interesting is actually medical devices and medtech, and the reason being is if you compare with the pharma or biotech space, where there's just the last 10 to 15 years has seen just some absolutely unbelievable breakthroughs in science. But one of the problems we're coming up to now with on the biotech side or the pharma side is the results of this innovation of the science are now coming out. If you look at things like gene therapies, amazing products that, you know, essentially curing diseases that were uncurable before, fantastic, except it costs $500,000 for a treatment, you know, so, you know, there's a lot that's is being thought about now is how do they think about almost economic models to make this work or make them available. If I look on the medtech side, it's almost the reverse. Innovation is actually, so sorry to say, you know, no matter how good the science is, if the product costs $500,000 for a patient, that's reducing access, because how many people can actually afford, or even governments will be paying $500,000 for treatment. But in the medical device side, a lot of the interesting technology is, I would argue, is actually expanding access, because very broadly speaking, the products are getting smaller, they're getting cheaper, they're getting digital, they're gone from being, you know, the size of a table to actually something that can fit in your hand, or even now the latest thing is frankly software. right? And so to me, this is where a lot of really interesting innovation is happening in medical technology, because what it means is that not only is it more accessible, but also it's for the first time maybe breaking out of the hospital walls. So instead of people having to go to the hospital, and particularly in Asia where everybody goes to the hospital for everything, that, if you will, the diagnosis or even the treatment could come to you wherever you are, right? And I think a lot of that's happening in the medical device side, and that's, for me, it's pretty interesting. The other thing, and then on the more the digital side, I think this is where we have an enormous range of things from, I think, that are incredibly interesting and addressing real problems, to things that are clones of things that were really for other industries. So, I'm sorry, and I hope I'm not offending anyone in the room, but your app for booking appointments is not going to change the world, right? But a lot of the stuff is, I'm sorry, anybody here's startup is apps booking appointments, right? And it comes back a little bit earlier. I was thinking the reverse of what Hsien was saying about startups. As a startup, if you think about when you're coming to pitch, one of the first things is, have you really defined exactly the problem you're trying to solve? The fastest way, I always tell people, the fastest way for me, if I'm meeting a startup for the first time, to run out of the room is so they say what they're going to do is they're going to transform healthcare. Okay? You're Medtronic, right? So let's put it this way. Apple, Google, Amazon are themselves trying to transform healthcare. I'm sorry, but a startup is not going to transform healthcare. It's just too big. But if you find a definable problem, and there's almost limitless numbers of problems in the healthcare sector, right? Find, as Helindt said, find a definable problem and solve it. That's the first thing, right? Know what you're trying to do, right? And and that's the first thing. And then figure out how are you going to do it, and then how do you go take it out. But for me, the first thing is identify exactly what it is, the problem you're trying to solve, right? And like I said, there's plenty.
Joseph, as someone who also invests across categories, do you generally share that opinion? Are there certain categories that are exciting to you, or is there something else you wanted to say, because it looked like you wanted to jump in before?
No, that's already escaped my short-term memory. No, I have to agree with Jeff here. I think that the device space is getting far more exciting. I don't touch biotech either, because frankly, if it's a bad drug or a good drug, there's nothing I can do about it. It's 0 or 1. Whereas if it's a technology, then even if it's not best of class, maybe there's a business model that can be made. Maybe there's certain markets where it's a better fit. Maybe there's a certain pathway or certain improvements that can be made. And especially if it's a 510K, it doesn't take all that long to update the registration status of it. So it is fixable in a lot of the cases. What I personally really love is the decentralization of healthcare. Because right now, we know more about our cars than we do our human bodies by number of magnitudes. I mean, if we're lucky, we go to the doctor once every 2 years to get our biomarkers measured. Why don't we have continuous telemetry? Why do we have to wait until something actually breaks before we go fix it? You go do preventative maintenance on your car. For those in Singapore who have cars, it's very expensive here. I don't have a car. I never will have a car. You go and you take proactive measures, and right now we don't have the ability to this day to do this effectively. So I like little trinkets and gadgets that collect data that then put that data somewhere else and then integrate it meaningfully. I think there is one massive void in the market which is very difficult to solve, and maybe it would take an Apple-like player, and I hope it's not Apple because they're expensive, is really integrating and standardizing that data in a structured manner. So some nations have done this with their national health records plus national claims database. So it's very easy to link cost and outcome and procedure. Now, if we can do that in a way that integrates all the new telemetry that's going to come in, that would be really powerful. And we haven't seen a company that really does that effectively, and well, we may have to build that one day if we don't see a company that does that effectively. Apple is actually, interestingly, doing something quite potentially powerful in the US, but to get that outside of the US, outside of developed rich markets is going to be difficult because, you know, they are $1 trillion company, and making a bigger, shinier iPhone isn't going to, you know, sustain that growth forever.
Well, thank you. So I'd love to open this up to audience questions at this point. I mean, we have so many people who are aspiring health tech entrepreneurs themselves, or perhaps in the trenches right now. So who's got a question? I know somebody has a question.
We could cold call questions.
Yeah. Okay, we got one in the back over here. We got two.
Thank you.
What startup has surprised you the most in the last few years? Whose success has surprised you?
Any?
I would say that there have been quite lots of disappointment. You had things like Ginger.io, which were extremely exciting about predicting risk of suicide based on your mobile activity, for example. And that was actually coming from the MIT. So it had lots of investments, a lot of things, and boom, that disappeared when they switched to the business part of it. Maybe actually in France or in Europe, you've had a big boom of doctor reservation business. and it starts to be switching from something which is very basic, a bit like Facebook when it started, and then now it's switching to integrating the remote consultation part. And when you have all that part already built and the link with the doctors and so on, and you can start building far more on top of it, because you can measure more. And that's also our approach. We start by making something that the people want to use, which is not always the case in healthcare. Many people forget that in the end the patient needs to use it. So you build something that people want to use, you make it scale, and then when you're scaling, thanks to the data, you can do far more with it. Because if you want to start to predict, as was mentioned by Joseph, you don't predict by doing something on 200 patients. You make a real prediction by building something on top of a huge amount of high quality data. And Medtronic, for example, can do wonderful things with the continuous tracking of blood sugar and insulin, and that's when you start doing things at scale, you can really start to do to change the world. So one specific company, integration of numerous technologies and things which are going at scale, I would say is the most impressive in healthcare, scaling.
Yeah. Would anybody else?
Yeah, count of 3.
Right.
2, 3.
Theranos. Anybody heard of that?
Yeah, but the reason being is that it's not that it was infeasible, it's just how far they got with like no real due diligence. It's incredible. To be more positive, I also think another one that surprised me quite a bit was HaloDoc. Actually, now I gave it some thought, because when HaloDoc was getting started, it was a very kind of fragmented space with everyone trying to basically do the same thing, but these guys did it. They integrated with Gojek. They managed to get prescription pharmacy drugs, not just over the counter, delivered point to point. They are going cashless, and now they're starting to go online to offline. So I was actually pleasantly surprised about that. Yeah, Jeff?
Actually, I was going to go there as well. I thought it was going to be cheating to talk about Grab and Gojek. But I think to add to this, the recent announcement, I guess, about the joint venture between Grab and Ping An Good Doctor, for those who don't know about that, it's actually adopting the same model as what HaloDoc and Gojek have, where basically you're entering through this ride-hailing app has now become kind of the platform for your life, and you can do all this. So with the Good Doctor, even with an AI-driven engine doing diagnostics. So for those of you who haven't seen it, you actually typing in your symptoms and a kind of a chatbot is responding and interacting with you, and then referring you to either an internal doctor of good doctors, a teleconsultation, or an external one, which you then can pay a fee. You can then get a prescription, you pay for your medicines delivered. And why I think this is interesting, I was in a conference a couple of weeks ago, which was talking about market access, and it was you know, a room full of health economists and people like this who are normally thinking about government policies. And I threw out the question, this announcement just come out. Grab claims to have 100 million users of its apps. If 1% of those people by next year are accessing Good Doctor through this, essentially their ride-hailing app, that's a million people who will be accessing healthcare through something. Now, there were people in the room from US and Europe and having to explain, this is basically like you're using Uber to talk to your doctor. So I think this is something that's, particularly in this part of the world, is really interesting that, it's actually becoming, a way to use digital to kind of integrate healthcare with the rest of your life. And to me, this is something that's really interesting because one of the issues we always have is healthcare is somehow separate. Like it's too hard, or you have to, go do something separately, or you have to wait for someone to give you permission to do something. But if it's right there in the hand on the device you're already using, with the app you're already using every day, to me, that's very powerful.
Okay, we've got some questions now. So this lady in the back over here was the second to raise her hand, so I'm going to just walk all the way back. Can I? Yeah, why don't you?
Well, I can answer the second one first. And the first one, I think we kind of covered a little bit in our kind of med device, both, outside of apps. Yeah, no, but med device aren't apps. They're physical hardware pieces that would do something. So in terms of what we look for early, I think team is number one. I've seen a lot of cases where you have really good technologies and the team's either incomplete, team conflicts, or there isn't a team, it's just a solo innovator. That's a red flag for us. The second thing is, are you solving a real problem? There are many ways to make money in this world. You can, invest in a blockbuster drug, you can buy property, you can speculate on crypto, you can do all that. But the way we've chosen to try to make our money is through solving real, tangible, large, important healthcare problems. So if you're trying to solve something that affects 500 people, then that's not interesting to us. If it affects 1 billion people, then we're very interested. The third thing is some sort of edge. What is separating you from other people? Is it technology? Is it, particular intellectual property? Is it some other barrier? Do you have a data set that they don't have? Do you have a business model that is innovative? Do you have a lockdown on critical ecosystem partners, which is insurmountable to the competition? Do you have some know-how? Do you have patents? And then the last thing is really governance, both corporate and country of origin governance. So what I mean by that is, are you properly incorporated? Do you have proper structures? One thing I see is this kind of subsidiary mania where I see a startup and they've, incorporated in 10 different places and the shareholder structure is all messed up. I'm like, guys, you're not even worth like $100,000 yet. Why do you have 10 companies? It's ridiculous. And that makes things complicated, and it's unnecessarily so, and it's usually a sign of greed, which we don't like. And then in terms of country of origin governance, I mean, look, if we can't actually have any legal mechanisms to go after you if you're misbehaved, then we generally will not go for that. Or if the country is just not conducive to business, we wouldn't go for that. We're too small, we're too early, that we don't want to put up with that. So either you move to a country of better governance, or you find another investor. So example, Belarusian company moving to Estonia. If it's, say, a country in Southeast Asia that might not have very good governance, we'd ask them to move to Singapore. It's just simpler for everybody.
Okay, I think we're just going to have people call out their questions because I'm not going to be able to get the mics to you. So over here.
So you mentioned just hit the nail on the head. You
Mm-hmm.
So
That's a fantastic question. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to take a first stab. I can.
maybe one
Yeah.
thing with China is that it's really a beast by itself.
Yeah.
You don't go there alone. You need somebody to protect you. You've seen the biggest
Literally.
companies, even like Google and so on, completely being destroyed there. So it's great. They will do wonderful things after being able to go like that and say, hello, I will change China. Sometimes you have to be modest, but thinking about what they are doing there, that they can do thanks to a different mindset and the different regulations, is also showing the path in terms of data, for example. And there will be great things coming out of the massive use of the data, and there will be terrible things coming from the massive use of the data in healthcare and other sectors.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm inspired by China in certain ways. I mean, recently there was a Babylon Health ping on pilot of 80 million people. Pilot of 80 million people. Like, let that sink in for a moment. You have digital health platforms that have 5 million doctors on them. That's 70% of all HCPs in China. And 5 million doctors is also, interestingly, close to the number of doctors we're missing in Asia Pacific as a whole if we were to get up to even where Singapore is today, let alone OECD. It is incredible what they have done with a relatively semi-closed ecosystem by shutting out the great American internet companies. WeChat is a super app. You can do everything on WeChat. You can pay with WeChat. You can summon services with WeChat. You can see your doctor on WeChat. You can talk to, you can do just about anything with this app. How this can go outside of China is yet to be seen in scale, because it has evolved in the symbiotic environment of BAT. Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. You are starting to see companies explore. Right now if you go outside of healthcare, if you look in e-commerce, right, it's a turf war between Alibaba and Amazon. JD's coming out of China. So you're starting to see forays. So this kind of groundwork for more sophisticated services and products, I think, will start to happen. I mean, you're starting to see the ping on with Grab, which Jeff had mentioned earlier. Zhong'an recently, and who here knows who Zhong'an is? Like, show of hands. Like one person. It's funny, that's an Angmo who knows who Zhong'an is. Two. Oh yeah, two Angmos, wonderful. So Zhong'an is a wacky company. It is a tech company that happens to do insurance. It is rebuilding insurance from the ground up. Conventional insurers have had the same business model for like 100 years. And basically, people were hired into insurance to basically make sure you don't mess with the model. That's why it's very, very difficult to, it's very, very difficult to change the way they do business. Zhong'an was built from the ground up as a tech company that happens to sell insurance products. As a consequence, they do wacky things, like your glucometer reading will factor into the cost of your premium tomorrow. So they do daily premium, not monthly, not annual. How much you walk. They'll do genetic screening to see whether they should insure you or what premium they should charge based on what oncogenes you have, which is very Orwellian. I see the look on your face. It's very terrifying. But for some people, for example, if they were previously uninsurable, now the math suggests that you are insurable. And yeah, for some others, yeah, you're up the creek, unfortunately. Anyways, SoftBank just put $500 million into them so that they will expand out of China to be the actuarial engine for legacy insurers in the region. And that has some pretty big implications if it were to work. Don't know. China also has the largest number of CAR T molecules in development, if you want to skirt into biotech a little bit. And Janssen recently licensed a molecule from, was it Legend in, I think it was in Shanghai, but I can't remember the details, which apparently seems to cure multiple myeloma, although there's been some controversy over the data lately, so the stock has been fluctuating a bit. This is also kind of interesting because before people weren't thinking of China as a drug developer, but it turns out a lot of the professors who were doing this in the US got lured back, and got lured back with very nice incentive packages. I went to, I was visiting Zhejiang province. There's an incubation park that literally said, high technology park for high level overseas talents. And this company, which I visited, who was kind of looking for a bit of VC funding, the government was basically paying for all the R&D, gave him $2 million, and he actually doesn't even really need my money. He just wants another, wants an investor to help him test some of the commercial models and go outside. So he's entirely bootstrapped, paid for by the government. I mean, that's pretty crazy. And it's not like it's one building in this park. There's like 15 buildings in this park with like 6 companies to each floor. It is pretty crazy, the scale. So, one of the reasons I quit my kind of high-flying corporate job is to, and literally I was on a plane like every other day, was really because I think a lot of my portfolio companies are going to be acquired by Chinese companies, and I didn't want to wait. To be completely pragmatic about it. Sorry, I've gone on for a while.
I wanted to mention something about China. I mean, first of all, I found China incredibly scary because I was born in Taiwan, right? So I had to overcome this like, oh my gosh. But at the end of the day, the size of China, the country, and the homogeneity that they are dealing with gives them an edge beyond what we can do in our region, say Asia Pacific, ex-China. Which I think speaks to the fact that if we could have better collaboration, better regulatory harmonization across ASEAN even, we would be able to consolidate some of our efforts and overcome some of the humps, right? Because that's the advantage that China has. The other thing that astonishes me about China is that they haven't necessarily, maybe in my limited knowledge, exported a lot of what they've done or subjected themselves, we know this for a fact, to competition. And if you look at the way ASEAN countries in particular, but even North Asia countries, Japan, Korea, and Malaysia at one point tried to do this, which is how do they go from being an agricultural economy to a stellar economy that we see today, really based on professional services, intellectual property? They went through these distinct phases of agriculture, manufacturing, and all of that. But inherent within these phases was learning about how to compete on in a global market. And if you don't have that element of competition, it doesn't help these companies get stronger and better. So yes, they have a captive audience of a few billion people within their country, but the true test of perhaps, and this might be too strong of a word, but global domination or global power in that sense is their ability to compete outside of China.
Maybe one big thing is the fact that Southeast Asia is very diverse. You will have many different regulations. After, it depends what you put into medtech, because Allodoc is not really medtech. It's a platform. It's web mostly. It's intermediation. It's digitalization of the healthcare system. Traditionally, medtech is about having a patent and going up to the FDA and all the validations, which takes years and years to get approved. And this is something very national. You go to the FDA. If you go in Europe, you go to EMEA, and you have to have your filing. Traditionally, it was trucks of paper that you were sending there. And in China, they also have this advantage is that when you send your truck of paper, Then first they photocopy everything and they transmit to local companies. But then after, if they accept it, you will get something that you can sell all over the country and nobody else is authorized to sell. So why does it take time? Segmentation, the fact that it's a puzzle of different, different needs and different regulations.
So for Southeast Asia, can I have your opinion that Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines, which are the ones that see the medtech startups are doing better, given that in Southeast Asia, to your point, they're very diverse and very nationalistic. So it is very difficult to say, oh, I do something in Singapore, and every country in Southeast Asia would use it. There's a factual segmentation and competition. So I'd like to hear your panel, your view. The three countries, Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines, which other country you see the health tech startup are booming with more success? Forget about like Ms. Lei, you say, those that are failing. Let's not talk about that. Can I have your view, please?
So we're talking health tech, not med tech, right?
Health tech, yes.
Yes. And it was Thailand, Indonesia,
Indonesia and Philippines.
and Philippines. Okay. I think there's been quite a lot coming out of Indonesia. And I think partly because they can scale bigger in Indonesia than, a little bit like a mini China. They can get bigger. Look at what Gojek's done. Look at what Halodoc. They can reach a larger audience. And getting scale matters, right? Philippines has also had some interesting startups. I think what we're going to see, for instance, though, Halodoc, is we're going to see a test to that because they are going to be following Gojek out into the rest of the region, right? So Gojek is, as you know, is expanding to take on Grab. And the plan is that Halodoc, as Gojek has invested in Halodoc, that Halodoc will effectively follow them out into the rest of the region. And it'll be a little bit interesting to see because Gojek's model is slightly different than Grab's. Grab is, you have essentially a single model everywhere. It pretty much works the same. Whereas Gojek is, at least so far, is trying to maybe have a more localized version when they go to each market. So we'll see if, as they look in the health tech side, if it's something similar. I did want to touch something about Singapore, though. You mentioned a lot of startups here. The question is not maybe so much nationalistic. Is that Singapore is one very small but also a very rich and developed market. Where the needs of Singapore are not the needs of the surrounding countries, right? And so there is maybe some constraints in terms of development of the market. There's constraints around, as you said, culture. I mean,
that's why I never added Singapore in the list.
Yeah. So, but again, mostly what's happening right now has been these platforms have been developed for domestic market. Someplace like Thailand, for instance, will have certain additional constraints as they're working in Thai language, so it's really focusing on the Thai market. It's not so exportable, let's say, something developed for the Philippines. Indonesia, the companies to date have been able to, let's say, before they leave their market, as I said before, they already have significant scale. So I think what we're going to see over the next, couple of years is probably a little bit of an archetype versus a one model fits all, like effectively the Grab model and how they'll try to roll out a good doctor combination. And then the Gojek model, which is a little bit consciously try to localize in each market as they roll out.
Sure. We have time for about 2 more questions, and this fellow in the back over here with the purple shirt has, yeah.
Well, you're talking to the right person. Anybody who's interested in connecting with our R&D colleagues, you can speak to me, and I can first talk to you about your idea, and then determine which avenue you can go. But I have to say it is a pretty tough haul, right? Because as I mentioned, we do have a corporate strategy, and at the end of the day, most of our R&D at this point in time is actually in the US. So at some point in the history of Medtronic, we did do some R&D in the region. We still have an R&D facility in India, but it's focused on delivering prototypes, et cetera, based on corporate instruction. So that's something I'm looking to change as well, to think about what R&D we can do in the region. In China, for example, we acquired Kanghui and Kangdi, which were local companies, because we wanted R&D in the country, and we wanted to be able to produce products that were geared towards not the premium segment, but the value segment. It's been very difficult. But that doesn't mean I would give up on that. It's just I want to manage your expectation that there is a way, but it is not as easy as if you had a late stage, product that's ready to be FDA reviewed or CE mark, et cetera. And I wanted to make a comment about the reimbursement bit too, because if you're looking for funding from a MNC like Medtronic, you really do want to go the reimbursement route, because that is something that for us makes it easier to go to market. And at the end of the day, with so many countries in our region going for universal healthcare, it's something that I don't think you can avoid, right? So there's not, in my opinion, so many medical technology companies or medtech that's going to be able to survive without some level of reimbursement. But that's just my opinion.
I would concur, generally speaking, for the end state, but it's case by case based on how expensive the technology is, where you want to use it, what setting, et cetera, et cetera. Then the question is, who's going to pay, public or private or employer, which is often overlooked by a lot of startups. Generally, I find consumers are more fickle, but the sales cycles are shorter. So if there is a way to pragmatically explore the different financing models, in the meanwhile, while you're finding your way, then that's potentially interesting. Also, the other thing is, do you want to go for something that's paid for by, say, by a pharma company because you're doing something useful to them? Accelerating clinical trial recruitment or making drug development more efficient as a first stage before you go try to address the big population health problem. So it's not necessarily an either or, but I think you do have to take a case-by-case look at it.
Just want to add one thing. For the pharma and medtech companies, what they're very good at is taking innovations from small companies for innovations or technologies which are sort of like what they already have. So drug companies are very good at taking in new potential drugs, or device companies are new potential devices. What the newer frontier, I guess, is, let's say, is a Medtronic looking at can they support a digital platform that's being developed, or something that doesn't fit into their traditional product development kind of process, right? So like I said, if you've got a medical device in development, absolutely. I mean, Hsien can plug you into a machine that's designed to look at technologies from even external innovators and develop them, right? And that's one of the core, I guess, capabilities of big companies, is taking these outside innovations, looking at things that are a little bit different. That's where it's, I guess, the newer frontier. Right?
And one thing to keep in mind when you're on the entrepreneur side and working with those big machines is that you have to be very, very, very patient. It will be, and your investors have to understand that. If you have investors who are used to e-commerce, flee, go away, go and try to do things for patients, even if it's far more difficult, because you have to be extremely detail-oriented and you have to understand every small things and sentiment of the patient. But everybody should be on the same line that working with corporate is like that. You have to wait for years, and you never know. It can explode at any time.
So we have time for one more, and I saw a hand shoot up back there.
Singapore is a very expensive place.
No.
So for the startups, what advice can you give, especially when we have pre-revenue?
Hawker centers are cheaper. No, but be careful with.
Just now, Joseph was talking about property. So you have a dilemma. A property costs a lot of money. And startups cannot afford the money. So how do you reach a startup?
You go to Bash. Yeah, you have to be careful about the cash. It's still cheaper than being in Silicon Valley. It's still cheaper than being in Switzerland. And after, you have to be being super careful about the cash all along. And it's not because at some point you're raising money and taking money from somebody else that it's the luxury life and that you find business or first class or anything else.
I think it's a double-edged sword. Singapore is very expensive, but the wages are also very high. So if you've got parts of the team that are still working in their corporate jobs, they can funnel the funding into the startup, and you can bootstrap a lot more effectively than you could in other places. You can actually do business development. You can actually look for development partners in your neighboring, markets. And so I've seen a lot of very successful bootstraps, which were kind of held successfully on a lifeline from somebody who's still working in their full-time job and making a good salary. The other thing is, what's expensive about Singapore? I find the most expensive thing about Singapore is, again, the talent. Because you can find an office for like $700 a month if you're willing to look really hard. Or, yeah, well, no, WeWork's expensive, man. I'm talking about like the cheap ones. So if you're willing to kind of, again, as Francois said, be a little bit frugal, maybe really question whether you actually need all this physical infrastructure when a lot of you are doing like a healthcare app. I mean, what do you need an office for? Like, find a hawker center, have a $3 beer, and discuss your ideas. No one's gonna care. No one's gonna steal your idea. So you got to ask what's expensive about Singapore, because I've actually, since moving here from Toronto. People would think that my expenses would have gone up astronomically, but actually went down significantly since moving here. And Toronto's not Silicon Valley. It's not Boston. It's not New York.
Yeah, and I think another comparable place is Japan. So I lived in Japan for 5 years, and before we moved there, my parents were like, how are you going to afford living there? But when I moved there, I found there were many ways to do business and to live daily within quite a moderate budget. But what I love about Singapore, my husband's Singaporean, you can tell I'm not so Singaporean, but I've been here for 10 years. And one thing I love about Singapore is that the government is willing to extend a helping hand. And that there are so many startup incubators here that even if I wanted to start one for Medtronic, I'm kind of like, it's saturated here. I don't know if we need another one. So can I offer my support in a different way? But I've certainly admired even the way EDB is always there to help provide some funding, some guidance, even organizations that you would be surprised would offer funding like STB, right? If you are holding an event for your company because you're looking to share knowledge or whatever, if it draws in a certain type of crowd, one example is the Asia Pacific Medical Technology Association. When they first started out, they had very little, but Singapore Tourism Board supported them on their annual forum, which is kind of like, oh, really? That's a source of funding? Yes, it was. And that then enabled them to grow in different ways, recruit members, et cetera. It's just an example that in Singapore, there are more avenues in which you can explore to receive some support.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I know that there are some additional questions in the audience. I know at least a couple of us are going to hang around for at least a few minutes afterwards, so feel free to approach us with any additional questions. You've been a great audience today. I've been amazed that the vast majority of you have basically been looking up the whole time. So thank you so much for your attention, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, Will.